This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history. Episode 26, The Beauty of Holiness. France had certainly changed. James Monroe watched the streets roll past his carriage window, neat and orderly, though he could still sense a tension beneath the surface. It was the kind of unease that comes when power is concentrated in the hands of one man. Paris as he found it today was a different city from the one that he had known nearly a decade before. In 1794, when he had first arrived as America's minister to France, the shadow of the revolution still lingered. The worst days of the terror had passed, yet the memory of the guillotine was fresh. Crowds had gathered not long before to cheer the fall of aristocrats and priests, and the stain of that frenzy remained. His wife Elizabeth had been with him then, and it was she who had shown the truest courage. With quiet determination, she had visited Adrienne de Lafayette, the imprisoned wife of the Marquis. That single gesture of compassion, so simple and so daring, had helped to secure Adrienne's release. Those memories seemed distant now, but they flashed across James's mind as he passed familiar boulevards, changed but still marked by the revolution's hand. Truth be told, conditions under Napoleon Bonaparte were far calmer than under Robespierre and the Jacobins. The endless tumults of the revolution had given way to order, but it was order enforced by an authoritarian. Napoleon was not emperor yet, but as first consul for life, he already ruled France with an iron grip. There were no more mobs in the streets, no more tribunals of terror, but every whisper suggested that rebellion against the consulate was unthinkable. And France's ambitions did not stop at her own borders. Napoleon's wars already unsettled Europe, and his designs reached even across the Atlantic. That was what had brought James here again, summoned from his home and family, for a task upon which the fate of the American West might well depend. The carriage jolted to a halt before the modest apartment where he was to lodge. James stepped out, his thoughts already turning from the streets to the daunting mission ahead of him. He had heard Jefferson's instructions plainly enough. Your mission is of the utmost importance. The prosperity of our Western citizens depends upon free navigation of the Mississippi. Spare no effort to secure New Orleans and its trade for the United States. Jefferson's words rang in his ears even now. Spain had closed the port of New Orleans the previous year, crippling American trade. And though the territory still appeared under Spanish administration, it was no secret that France had reclaimed Louisiana by treaty. Western farmers had begun clamoring for war, fearing that France intended to build a new empire on the Mississippi. Monroe knew the consequences if those fears proved true. He unpacked his papers in the quiet of his rooms and glanced at his commission, signed by Secretary of State James Madison. For this mission, Jefferson had given him full powers, and he felt the weight of that trust. He had not sought this post, especially with Elizabeth's health uncertain at home, but he had accepted it. To secure peace, to safeguard the Mississippi, and to guard against Napoleon's designs, there could be no greater service to his country. The next day, James sat across from Robert Livingston, America's regular minister in Paris. Livingston was tall, somewhat heavy in figure, with a wide forehead and commanding features. Yet just now his posture was weary, his expression heavy with discouragement. "I will speak plainly, Mr. Monroe," he said at last, rising to pace the room, hands clasped behind his back. "I have labored here nearly 2 years, employing every argument that might commend itself to reason, to interest, even to flattery, and yet I have gained nothing. They delay, they defer, they smile, and always we are put off again. I begin to fear that the matter is hopeless." James regarded him steadily. "I do not doubt your exertions, Mr. Livingston, nor the patience required of you. You have borne a heavy burden on behalf of our country." Livingston stopped and turned sharply. "Patience, yes, but patience wears thin. The First Consul has ambitions far beyond the Mississippi, and his ministers are not easily moved. I have pressed them with every consideration of commerce and consequence, but they remain obstinate." This conversation was certainly not endowing James with any confidence that the situation might be handled quickly. But he had come to see this matter resolved, and God willing, they would. "Then we must try them anew," he said firmly. "With my commission, we now stand as joint plenipotentiaries, empowered to conclude a treaty. You are no longer bound by the restraints that hindered you alone. Together, perhaps, our cause may gain greater weight in their eyes." At this, Livingston exhaled, lowering himself into his chair. "You have the confidence of a recent arrival, Mr. Monroe. May it serve us better than the experience of these past 2 years." The days that followed passed in a blur of careful preparation. James and Livingston rehearsed their arguments and debated every possible turn of the negotiation, knowing that the fate of the Mississippi, and perhaps the fate of the United States itself, hung in the balance. At last, the appointed morning arrived, and James and Livingston entered the high-ceilinged chamber where the French ministers awaited them. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, gilding the ornate frames and polished tables. Courtesies were exchanged, measured bows, a few polite phrases in French, before Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign minister, gestured for them to be seated. The first minutes passed in formal pleasantries, assurances of friendship, mentions of past treaties, and carefully worded observations on European affairs. At length, Livingston drew forth his papers and leaned slightly forward. "Monsieur Talleyrand," he began, "we come once again to lay before you the earnest interest of the United States. The recent closure of the port of New Orleans has caused great distress among our citizens. We hope to resolve this in peace and goodwill, and are prepared to purchase the city of New Orleans should that meet with the approval of your government." Talleyrand's fingers tapped lightly on the table, his eyes moving from Livingston to James, as though taking their measure. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with deliberate calm, he replied, "Gentlemen, you speak of New Orleans. Yet you must know that the matter before us is larger than a single port. France has considerations of a far wider scope." James and Livingston exchanged a brief glance. Talleyrand continued, "The First Consul has determined that France has no long-term interest in retaining Louisiana. Circumstances compel him to act otherwise than he once intended. He is therefore prepared not to merely treat for New Orleans, but to cede to the United States the whole of Louisiana, for an agreed compensation." The words hung in the air. Livingston's hand froze above his papers, his mouth parted in astonishment. James felt the weight of the moment press upon him. This was not a bargain for a city, but for an empire. "The entire territory," Livingston managed at last, his voice betraying his shock. Talleyrand inclined his head slightly. "Entire, monsieur. From the Mississippi westward." A silence followed. James's mind raced with the implications. Doubling the nation's size, securing the great river, banishing France from the continent. He steadied his voice before replying, "Monsieur Talleyrand, such an offer exceeds even the hopes with which we came. We must confer with our government on the particulars of price and terms, but you may be assured that the United States will give this most serious and favorable consideration." Talleyrand's expression revealed nothing. He merely inclined his head again, his fingers folding together atop the table. Livingston glanced at James, still wide-eyed. "If this be true," he murmured in English, "we are witnessing the turn of history." There has been no more impactful sermon in history, Christian or otherwise, than the Sermon on the Mount delivered by Jesus Christ near the Sea of Galilee. Penetrating teachings like "love your enemies," judge not, and do unto others as you would have done unto you, broadsided an audience who knew only too much of the world's cruelty. The Jews were being oppressed by Rome, and many hoped that the promised Messiah would come to crush their enemies. But here he sat speaking of peacemaking and purity, not only in your actions but in your thoughts. While the world for ages had been using outward force to bring about change, Christ focused on the inward change that would then lead to an outward result. He wisely taught that the first thing one must conquer is the self. A person who is a slave to their passions can never truly be free. You see, this is what makes Christianity so revolutionary. The world works from the outside in, whereas God works from the inside out. And so it follows that a free government that is run by the people is only sustainable when the people have the ability to control themselves. This is why John Adams said, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And Declaration signer Gouverneur Morris said this, "Religion is the only solid basis of good morals. Therefore education should teach the precepts of religion and the duties of man toward God." This is a repeated sentiment among the Founding Fathers, but it's an idea that's far from popular today. Some say that religion has nothing to do with morals, and that we don't need it. But what these people are overlooking is the fact that so many of the prized virtues of the Western world, like tolerance and kindness and freedom, are Christian values. These are the ideas that Christ repeatedly taught. And when we say that America is a Christian nation, we aren't saying that America is a theocracy, where we force everyone to be a professing Christian. It means that Christianity was majorly influential in shaping our culture and policies. You'll notice that the freest societies are generally places with a lot of Christian influence. Why is this? Because we do not compel from the outside in. We work from the inside out. And where Christianity is strong, freedom is bound to follow. This is why Christianity was at the heart of the abolitionist movements, both in America and in Britain. Why Martin Luther King Jr. consistently cited the Bible, specifically the Sermon on the Mount, to condemn discrimination. Why Gandhi referenced the teachings of Christ in his fight against oppression. And why the American Founding Fathers looked to Christianity and religion in general as one of the greatest supports of government and a stable society. About a month ago, I was listening to a history lecture where the historian said that most of the Founding Fathers were deists or agnostics. How can anyone who studies the Founding Fathers come away with an idea like this that is so completely off base? But then I thought, this is not a coincidence. This classic rewriting of history is a sad attempt to recreate our Founding Fathers in the image of our modern society. Surely, if they were deists or agnostics, then America is exactly what they hoped it would be. And the Founding Father who has been used to forward this narrative, perhaps more than any other, is Thomas Jefferson. So that begs the question, what did Thomas Jefferson really believe? Was he a deist or an atheist? Did he create his own Bible where he removed the miraculous and divine from the New Testament? Did he truly believe in the separation of church and state, starting the first secular university in America? In this last episode on Thomas Jefferson, I'll give you the answers to all of these questions, and hopefully be able to finish revealing the man behind the myths. In Thomas Jefferson's first term as President of the United States, he faced some significant challenges. He fought one actual war and barely avoided another. You see, throughout Washington and Adams administrations, a sixth of the budget had been set aside for tribute to the Barbary States, whose pirates threatened American trading vessels if the tribute was not paid. This led America to fight its first war on foreign soil, and it resulted in a peace treaty that boosted Jefferson's popularity. But even as he was dealing with this issue, a far more serious threat to the United States was lurking within the borders of his own continent. After the 7 Years' War, known as the French and Indian War here in America, Britain took control of all of the land east of the Mississippi River, and Spain took the land west of the Mississippi, which used to belong to France. But in 1802, it became public that the Spanish had secretly signed a treaty with Napoleon Bonaparte, returning the Louisiana Territory into French possession. This was a big deal. For one thing, the port of New Orleans was closed to American trade, which was critical to the nation's economy. But more than that, Jefferson was worried about the very real threat that Napoleon was preparing to erect a French empire in the New World. He instructed the American minister to France, Robert R. Livingston, to try and persuade Napoleon to cede New Orleans to the United States. He knew that otherwise, quote, "this embryo of a tornado would turn into war, and we must then marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation in order to fight the French and their Spanish allies." But negotiations did not go well initially. Napoleon seemed determined to hold onto New Orleans. And finally, James Monroe was sent by Jefferson with full government authorization to make a deal with France. The timing of this proved providential, because just after he arrived, the French's disposition flipped on a dime. They not only offered to sell New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana Territory for only $15 million. That's about 3 cents an acre, and it doubled the size of the United States. Napoleon's change of heart was so unexpected, and his decision so swift, that it stunned even his family members. According to his brother Lucien's memoirs, when he and their other brother Joseph found out about his plans to sell Louisiana, they were furious, and went to confront him about it. When they arrived at the Tuileries Palace, they found him in the bath. Joseph told Napoleon that he would lead the opposition to the deal, to which Napoleon rose up out of the water and accused his brother of being insolent, before purposely falling back in, creating a splash that soaked Joseph. And afterwards, Lucien told Napoleon, "If I were not your brother, I would be your enemy." To which Napoleon responded by smashing a snuff box on the floor. Needless to say, Napoleon's brothers were not happy about this decision. But Napoleon decided to move forward with the deal anyway. Which begs the question, why did Napoleon sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States? There are a couple of reasons we can point to. One, Napoleon had just learned that a rebellion in Haiti had driven out his troops. Losing the valuable colony, meant to be the foothold from which he'd launch his future New World Empire, shattered his plans. At the same time, he needed money for his renewed war with Britain. So the factors lined up just right. But the other miraculous part of this is that just days after he'd made this decision to sell, James Monroe arrived with full authority to make decisions on behalf of the United States. Napoleon was known to be impulsive at times, and because Monroe arrived at the perfect time, the United States was able to secure the deal before Napoleon could change his mind. Jefferson was thrilled when he heard the news. He'd long been an advocate of U.S. expansion, and was interested in the territory beyond the Mississippi before anyone had even thought of buying Louisiana. Months before the Louisiana Purchase, he'd sent a confidential message to Congress proposing that an expedition be sent to follow the Missouri River and eventually reach the Pacific. The project was approved, and Jefferson appointed his own private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to lead the expedition. Jefferson drew up the instructions for Lewis and Clark himself, and as these plans were coming together, the Louisiana Purchase was finalized. And the next year, Lewis and Clark set off on what would be a historic journey. But despite his eagerness for westward expansion, Jefferson did not want it to come at the expense of the Native Americans. He declared that white settlers should only obtain land by, quote, all honest and peaceable means. He wrote to Lewis insisting that, quote, nothing ought more to be avoided than the embarking ourselves in a system of military coercion on the Indians. And this quote from Jefferson well sums up his feelings on the subject. Our system is to live in perpetual peace with the Indians, and to cultivate an affectionate attachment from them by everything just and liberal which we can do for them, within the bounds of reason, and by giving them effectual protection against wrongs from our own people. Jefferson despised the practice of getting the Indians liquored up, and then when they were drunk, having them sign away their lands at unreasonable prices. He told a group of local tribal leaders, quote, I have not filled you with whiskey, as the English do, to make you promise or give up what is against your interest when out of your senses. This approach led Jefferson's presidency to have the most peaceful relations between the federal government and the various Indian nations living within the boundaries of the United States than any other during the first 100 years following American independence. During his last year as president, Jefferson said to a visiting delegation of tribal chiefs, I shall rejoice to see the day when the red men, our neighbors, become truly one people with us, enjoying all the rights and privileges we do, and living in peace and plenty as we do, without anyone to make them afraid, to injure their persons, or to take their property without being punished for it according to fixed laws. But what's fascinating is that Jefferson didn't just feel a great compassion for the Native Americans. He took a special interest in their history, culture, and languages. Historian Dumas Malone noted that, quote, few of his American contemporaries were so deeply interested in the Indians over so long a period as he, if indeed anybody was. Jefferson adamantly believed that the Native American tribes were sovereign nations, whose tribal rights should be respected equally with the American settlers. But what's interesting is that he not only promoted their fair treatment, but their education, both secular and spiritual. Edward Dowse pressed the packet flat beneath his palm, the air in his study heavy with the smell of wax and smoke. He inspected the name and address one last time, then rose from his desk. Inside lay a borrowed sermon, rare in America, that he hoped would be returned once the president was finished with it. It felt a little bold to send such material to the President of the United States, but Dowse and Jefferson had been correspondents for years. Both men shared a passion for books, ideas, and religion, and this sermon seemed especially worthy of Jefferson's attention. With that thought, Dowse tucked the packet under his arm and made his way to the post office. On Thomas Jefferson's desk in Washington, piles of correspondence competed for space. Petitions from farmers, reports from the Treasury, dispatches from Paris. Amid the clutter lay a thin packet sealed in red wax, bearing the name of Edward Dowse of Massachusetts. Thomas smiled faintly. Dowse was a wealthy retired merchant and an avid bibliophile. The two had often exchanged thoughts on philosophy and religion. Breaking the seal, Thomas unfolded the letter and the printed sermon tucked within. Glancing down at the title, he read, The Excellence of Christian Morality, a sermon preached before the Society in Scotland for Propagating Christian Knowledge, by Reverend William Bennett. In the letter, Dowse explained his reason for sending it, as its design, among other objects, is to promote the extension of civilization and Christian knowledge among the Aborigines of North America. It seemed to me to have a claim of your attention. He suggested that Thomas might even consider reprinting it for distribution among missionaries working with Native Americans. Thomas's interest was immediately piqued. Only weeks earlier, he had signed a law renewing authorization for missionaries to teach among tribes in the Northwest Territory. So the subject was very much on his mind. Dowse hinted at another motive too. The act might silence Thomas's critics, who accused him of being indifferent, even hostile, to religion. Thomas chuckled at that. The Federalist newspapers never did tire of painting him as a heathen or a deist. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas studied the sermon carefully. Reverend Bennett praised the transforming power of Christ's teachings, and urged that those teachings be spread even among distant peoples, like the Native Americans. One suggestion struck Thomas in particular, that missionaries should not overwhelm new learners with an entire Bible, but instead begin with select passages from Christ's own words. Jefferson found this both practical and wise. Printing full Bibles was costly, and newcomers might get lost in the genealogies instead of encountering the heart of the gospel. The idea stayed with him. When he had finished, Thomas carefully repackaged the sermon to send back to Massachusetts. Though Dowse had said no reply was needed, Thomas took the time to share his reflections. He thanked Dowse, but explained that he would not reprint the sermon. Any such act, he wrote, would very readily be ascribed to hypocritical affectation by those who, when they cannot blame our acts, have recourse to the expedient of imputing them to bad motives. In other words, his critics would find fault with him no matter what he did. Still, Thomas was moved by Bennett's central message. He told Dowse that while he valued the wisdom of the ancient philosophers, he believed the moral precepts of Jesus stood above them all, more pure, more correct, and more sublime. Thomas continued that where the philosophers had taught mainly self-control and the pursuit of personal peace, Jesus expanded morality to embrace all mankind, commanding not just good deeds, but even purity of thought, purifying, as it were, at the fountainhead. It was a philosophy unmatched by any other. Before closing, Thomas confessed to Dowse that writing about religion was dangerous for a man in his position. His opponents twisted every word, yet he refused to yield to what he called the shrine of intolerance. Freedom of conscience, he insisted, must be defended for everyone, even for those in error. To allow public opinion to dictate belief was to invite tyranny of the worst kind. With that, Thomas finished his letter, signing, "Accept my friendly salutations and high esteem, Thomas Jefferson." As he placed the packet aside for posting, Thomas's gaze lingered on the books lining his study walls. Reverend Bennett had been right about one thing. The teachings of Jesus had a profound effect on the human heart. Perhaps, Thomas thought, there was indeed a better way to share them with the native people of America. The idea that Thomas Jefferson so disliked Christianity that he created his own Bible is a lie that has circulated through both secular and religious circles. As the following passage from Worldliness Resisting the Seduction of a Fallen World illustrates, quote, "Hunched over his desk, penknife in hand, Thomas Jefferson sliced carefully at the pages of Holy Scripture, excising select passages and pasting them together to create a Bible more to his liking, the Jefferson Bible, a book he could feel comfortable with. What didn't make it into his personal worldview? Hell can't be. The supernatural, not even worth considering. God's wrath against sin? I don't think so. The very words of God regarded as scraps." And author Robert S. Alley wrote this, "Jefferson wrote his own Bible that excluded all references to miracles, wonders, signs, virgin birth, resurrection, the Godhead, and whatever else conflicted with his own religious thought. Many others have made similar claims to these. Are they right? Well, first of all, we need to view things in context. This claim is completely inconsistent with other things that Thomas Jefferson said and did, such as the fact that Jefferson made frequent references to scripture in his writing and correspondence, that he gave Bibles as gifts to family members, and that during a time when he was going through a personal financial crisis, he still made a generous contribution to the Virginia Bible Society, an organization which he was a lifelong member of, by the way. And on top of this, in 1798, Jefferson helped to finance the printing of the John Thompson Bible, which was a groundbreaking American edition of the Bible. And let's also remember that Jefferson had many full-length Bibles in his own personal library, which he studied thoroughly, many in their own original languages, like the French Geneva Bible, and the earliest Latin Bible printed in England. He also owned several Bibles written in Native American tongues, like Algonquin and Natick. Now, does that sound like someone who hated the Bible? Jefferson even said to a political leader, quote, "I have always said, and always will say, that the studious perusal of the sacred volume will make better citizens, better fathers, and better husbands." So if this is the case, where does this idea that he created his own Bible even come from? What is this infamous Jefferson Bible? Well, the first thing you need to know is that there is no such thing as the Jefferson Bible. Jefferson never used that term. This is a modern name that has been applied to one of two different works that Jefferson compiled about Jesus Christ. The first was put together in 1804, and the other in 1820, and they had two very different intents and purposes. The purpose for the first is explained in its title: The Philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth, extracted from the account of his life and doctrines given by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, being an abridgment of the New Testament for the use of the Indians, unembarrassed, or uncomplicated, with matters of fact or faith beyond the level of their comprehensions. You see, for years, Jefferson had taken an active interest in promoting Christianity among various tribes, and corresponded with leaders and ministers about matters related to the Indians, such as Edward Dowse, who sent Jefferson a sermon from a Scottish reverend about the importance of promoting Christian knowledge among all people, including the Native Americans in North America. Dowse sent that to Jefferson, knowing that it was something that would interest him. And in that sermon, Bennett said that full-length Bibles were not the thing to be sending among the Native Americans, because for someone just learning about Christianity, you don't want the first thing they read to be numbers. You'd want them to read the Gospels, or the evangelists, as Jefferson referred to them. And besides, printing Bibles was very difficult and expensive. Something smaller would be easier to circulate. So in 1804, he prepared a work for that purpose. Taking two Bibles that he had at the White House, he cut out passages and pasted them into a separate folio. It was, as Jefferson stated it, a digest of his, Jesus's, moral doctrines, extracted in his own words from the evangelists. So in other words, it was an abridgment of the four Gospels for the use of missionaries among the Indian people. Now, there's no surviving copy of Jefferson's 1804 abridgment, but we do still have the handwritten title page, the list of passages that he planned to include, and the two Bibles that he used for the project, from which they've made reconstructions. And from these reconstructions, it becomes clear, as Dickinson W. Adams points out, that it includes, quote, miracles such as the healing on the Sabbath in Luke 14:1-6, and the commission of Jesus to his disciples in Matthew 10, to go and heal the sick and raise the dead. It includes Jesus' teachings about the resurrection of the dead, about his own second coming, about his role as the judge of all men at the end of time. He is also shown forgiving the sins of men and women in a manner reserved for God alone. Jefferson also included examples of raising the dead, healing the blind, so that certainly does not follow the narrative that Jefferson removed the miraculous from the Bible. But what about his other so-called Bible from 1820? This second compilation was very different from his first, for a number of reasons. His 1804 work took him a couple of evenings to put together, but this other work was years in the making. Just like the first one, its purpose is revealed in its title, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. Something that many people don't know about Thomas Jefferson is that he spent literally decades of his life studying and comparing the moral teachings and philosophies of many of the world's greatest teachers and leaders, such as Cato, Socrates, Plato, Cicero, etc. But after this intense study, he came to the conclusion that the moral teachings of Jesus were superior to all others. And on numerous occasions, he made clear that the only purpose he had for this 1820 work was to present the major moral teachings of Jesus in one concise collection. Jefferson faced many issues dealing with morality as president, and he decided that he wanted to prepare a work contrasting the moral teachings of non-Christian philosophers with those taught by Jesus. In a letter that he wrote to a friend addressing the subject, he said, quote, "The life, character, and doctrines of Jesus, his system of morals, was the most benevolent and sublime probably that has ever been taught, and consequently more perfect than those of any of the ancient philosophers." And he did this, in his own words, quote, "for my own personal use." Ultimately, as author David Barton explains, quote, "Writers who claim that this is the Jefferson Bible from which he excluded the supernatural are either ill-informed or ill-intentioned. Jefferson did not produce, and had no intention of producing, a theological or doctrinal work of exclusion. Rather, it was a moral work of inclusion, in which he compiled at least 81 different moral teachings of Jesus into one easily readable collection. But the secular bias of today's writers and scholars refuse to allow that work to be just what Jefferson said it was. They instead insist on converting it into an attack on the Bible and the supernatural." But just like the 1804 version, the 1820 version contained numerous references to the miraculous and the supernatural, such as healing on the Sabbath, the second coming, the resurrection of the dead, heaven and hell, angels, eternal life, and so on. So whether we're talking about the 1804 or the 1820 work of Jefferson's, neither one fits the description of this infamous Jefferson Bible. No one had even heard of either of these books for years. That is until 1886, when Cyrus Adler, the librarian for the Smithsonian, located Jefferson's personal copy, which was owned by his grandson. Congress purchased it in 1895, and in 1902, U.S. Representative John Lacey was so inspired by Jefferson's collection of Jesus' moral teachings that he sponsored a congressional resolution to reprint Jefferson's Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, and for the next 50 years, a copy was given to every senator and representative at his swearing into office. The idea was, if we could just live the moral teachings of Jesus Christ, we would not have corruption in our government. But this is only one of the charges laid against Jefferson's faith. What about the others? Why did people in his own time question his faith? And how did Thomas Jefferson truly feel about the separation of church and state? Manasseh Cutler pulled his coat tighter over his shoulders, a small pool of water gathering under the bench where his boots rested. The Hall of Representatives inside the newly finished Capitol building was drafty and crowded. Hundreds had gathered for the usual Sunday service, and the cavernous ceilings did not well contain the rapidly escaping heat from the fireplaces. Many of the attendees kept their coats, cloaks, and shawls about themselves to shield against the cold. but their wet clothing only added to the slight mustiness in the air. Manasseh glanced around. Many were still finding their seats, but one chair toward the front, he noticed, was still unoccupied. Any minute now he expected to see the arrival of the president, dressed in his typical plain waistcoat and breeches. Manasseh certainly did not agree politically with Jefferson, but he did find it curious that the man reputed to be irreligious in the papers did not fail to attend church every Sunday at the Capitol building. Without fail, he would ride up on his white horse and stride in, looking like an unassuming large-boned farmer, tall with very little excess flesh, and quietly take the seat that the congregation courteously left open for him after his first attendance there. Ever since Manasseh had become a congressman and moved to Washington, he'd carefully watched Jefferson, curious to take his measure. It seemed almost sacrilege for a man like him to be sitting in church when he obviously didn't believe any of the precepts of Christianity. As if his very thoughts had summoned him, Manasseh turned and saw the president enter the doors, his coat soggy from the rain, as without a word, he made his way toward the front, and took his seat next to his daughter Martha, who since his appointment had moved to Washington to act as First Lady and hostess for him. The meeting soon came underway, and Manasseh's jaw tightened when he saw who stood to deliver the sermon. Reverend John Leland, the Jefferson-loving traitor. It wasn't enough that the man was a Baptist. He was also a Democratic Republican, one of the few ministers in New England with that political leaning. Every Sunday it varied which preacher would give the sermon at the Capitol building, and from which Christian denomination. Manasseh was a Congregationalist minister himself, and had been a pastor in Massachusetts for more than 50 years, with only brief interruptions while he served in Congress. He listened with utter contempt as Leland began to speak. "And behold, a greater Solomon is here," Leland said, quoting from Matthew. He was clearly applying this verse to the current president, and Manasseh chafed at the concept. What blasphemy! It was an outrage upon religion, the Sabbath, and common decency. Surely every person with sense in attendance could see that. Manasseh shook his head, realizing that he should have seen this coming. He had heard about Leland's arrival in Washington 2 days before, carting perhaps the biggest slab of cheese the world had ever known. 1,600 pounds. Made by Leland and the members of his congregation as a gift to the president, congratulating him on his election to the presidency. Manasseh narrowed his eyes. Cheesemonger, he thought derisively. Poor, ignorant, illiterate, clownish preacher. He was no doubt invited by Jefferson himself to preach. Manasseh seethed through the entire sermon. When it was over, he rose to his feet, making a brisk exit. He didn't care what Leland said or believed. Jefferson was an enemy both to freedom and Christianity. Manasseh Cutler's perspective reflects how most of New England clergy felt about Thomas Jefferson. We set some of the political climate in the previous episode, but it's again critical for you to understand the context surrounding the claims against Jefferson's faith. The presidential election of 1800 was the first time that we saw political parties pitted against each other in America. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, or just Republicans as they were often called, with John Adams representing the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson the Republicans. At this period of time, the nation was very divided geographically. The northern or New England states were areas with higher population, and they were already used to having more involved government. So they tended to support the Federalists, who advocated for big government. Whereas in the rural South, meaning Pennsylvania downward, they were more accustomed to being left alone, and did not want a lot of government involvement. So they tended to support the Republicans, who emphasized states' rights. Many New Englanders were fiercely loyal to their representative, John Adams from Massachusetts, and those in the South felt the same way about Thomas Jefferson, who was from Virginia. So when these two came head-to-head in the 1800 election, the campaign became absolutely vicious, I mean, probably the most slanderous and venomous in American history. And you had attacks coming from both sides. John Adams would later write to his friend and fellow signer of the Declaration, Benjamin Rush, "If I am to judge by the newspapers and pamphlets that have been printed in America for 20 years past, I should think that both parties believed me the meanest villain in the world." But Adams did not face the degree of slander that Jefferson did. He was accused by Federalist critics of not just being anti-Christian and an atheist, but of being a murderer, a thief, and a cohort of foreign convicts. As Barton explains, quote, "He was accused of defrauding a widow and her children, and the nation was alerted that he planned to abolish the Navy and starve farmers. Citizens were warned that if Jefferson were elected, he would confiscate and burn every Bible in America. When he won the election, some New Englanders actually buried their Bibles so he could not find and destroy them." But much of the antagonism against Jefferson wasn't just coming from the newspapers, but was actually being preached across pulpits all over New England. Many of his most ardent opponents were pastors. In New England, churches were everywhere, and the clergy held an immense amount of influence on the community. So in a place as fervently religious as New England, there was no more effective way to defame someone than to claim that they were irreligious or immoral, which is exactly what they did to Jefferson. Reverend John Mason, for example, a New York Federalist, claimed that Jefferson was a, quote, "confirmed and hardened infidel, and one who, quote, writes against the truths of God's word, who makes not even a profession of Christianity, who is without Sabbaths, without sanctuary, without so much as a decent external respect for the faith and worship of Christians." These type of outrageous and completely unfounded accusations against Jefferson were unfortunately quite common. And some of the greatest promoters of these lies were clergy. As political historian Saul Padover put it, they accused Jefferson of everything. If the sermons of the clergy were to be believed, there was no crime in the calendar of which Jefferson was not guilty, and no unspeakable evil which he had not committed. Now, why am I telling you this? Because one of the modern lies about Jefferson is that he detested the clergy and fought against organized religion. And there are passages that you could lift from his letters, and by removing the context, you could paint that picture. But you'll find that again and again, those negative comments were directed toward Federalist preachers, not preachers altogether. Some of Jefferson's closest acquaintances were clergy, like John Leland from Massachusetts, who before the Revolution had lived in Virginia, where he was a pastor of a Baptist church. He had worked closely with Jefferson to disestablish the Anglican State Church in Virginia, giving equal opportunities and privileges to all denominations. And this was an act consistent with the stance Jefferson would take again and again. He was always in favor of religious liberty and against a state-established religion, and many loved him for that. Baptist Leland, for example, appreciated this because early in American history, Baptists had suffered persecution in certain parts of America. And it's worth noting, too, that Leland, who had a personal relationship with Jefferson, had the highest opinion of him, and recognized him as a champion of religious liberty. He said, quote, "We believe the supreme ruler of the universe, who raises up men to achieve great events, has raised up a Jefferson at this critical day to defend republicanism." Like the previous episode where the slanders concerning his morality were politically driven, you need to understand that the slanders against his faith are no different. Jefferson in no way hated all clergymen or opposed religious worship. One of the main reasons that Thomas Jefferson has become the poster boy for the secularist movement here in America is because it's from one of his letters that we get the infamous phrase, separation of church and state. And they interpret that to mean that Jefferson was a secularist who wanted to ban religion from the public sphere, or in other words, to use the government to keep religion in check. When in reality, the opposite is true. The figurative wall that he spoke about was not so much to keep religion out of the state as it was to keep the state out of religion. And the irony is that this phrase comes from a response he wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut, who had written to congratulate him on his election, and who, as a religious minority, were thrilled to see someone in office that they believed would defend their rights of worship. But in this letter, they did express one concern. They feared that by religious protection coming from the Constitution, they were essentially making religion a government-granted right. But they pointed out that the right to worship truly comes from God. It's not a matter to be determined by the government, because if government simply grants the privilege to worship, they can easily take it away, or impose a certain set of beliefs on their citizens. So Jefferson responded, assuring them that, quote, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." Thomas Jefferson knew that throughout history, one of the worst things that can happen is when religion becomes a tool of the government. That's why in the French Revolution, the people not only destroyed the monarchy, but tore down the church, because the church and the government were essentially the same. In England, King Henry VIII was not just the head of the government, but the head of the church, which is what caused the persecution of the Puritans that ultimately drove them to America. And there's countless other examples. Interestingly, the very day that Jefferson wrote his famous Separation of Church and State letter, January 1st, 1802, Reverend John Leland visited the White House, presenting Jefferson with a massive cheese with Jefferson's favorite motto etched into it: "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." And just 2 days later, Thomas Jefferson would attend church at the Capitol building, which he himself, when he was vice president, had approved for that use. And there he listened to John Leland preach. And we know Jefferson was there because Manasseh Cutler, who was a Federalist congressman, wrote about Jefferson's presence, as well as his dislike of both Jefferson and Leland. But Cutler's entry, along with others, confirms what many don't know, that through his 2 terms as president, Jefferson was a consistent church attendee at the Capitol, riding the 1.6 miles on horseback in his humble way, even through bad weather. Now today we can't even imagine this. Our seat of government was for many years the largest church in America. During John Quincy Adams' time in politics, it was reported to have up to 2,000 attendees. Jefferson once explained his reason for attending to a friend as they walked to church together. Quote, "No nation has ever yet existed or been governed without religion, nor can be. The Christian religion is the best religion that has been given to man, and I, as chief magistrate of this nation, am bound to give it the sanction of my example." But of course, this is completely ignored by Jefferson critics. They also like to ignore the fact that Jefferson, as governor of Virginia, introduced bills such as the bill to punish people for breaking the Sabbath day, which included a fine for those found working, and another bill appointing days of public fasting and Thanksgiving. This was a man who literally said, quote, "Among the most inestimable of our blessings is that of liberty to worship our Creator in the way we think most agreeable to His will, a liberty deemed in other countries as incompatible with good government, and yet proved by our experience to be its best support." The only conclusion we can draw from this is that anyone who holds up Jefferson as a pinnacle of secularism does not know him at all, and that they are so agenda-driven that they can only draw these conclusions by removing all context. For example, they'll tell you that Jefferson founded the University of Virginia as the first secular university in America, when what he really did was establish the first non-denominational university in America, where all religions could be welcomed and represented. But this goes beyond his feelings about religion in the public. Jefferson had a personal relationship with his God, as so many of the Founding Fathers did, which exhibited itself in incredible ways. Benjamin Rush stared up at the ceiling, his eyes heavy, but his thoughts restless. He had spent many nights like this, his mind troubled by circumstance. His wife Julia slept peacefully beside him, her quiet breathing the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Between the attacks on his medical practice, trouble with his children, and the state of political affairs in America, he had much to concern himself with. Benjamin had been so consumed with family matters that he'd let an entire year slip by without writing to congratulate his friend Thomas Jefferson on his retirement from office. He felt sure that Jefferson must be enjoying his escape and throwing himself back into his old habits and domestic interests. Benjamin wasn't entirely sure how John Adams felt about the power of presidency transferring to James Madison, who was yet another Republican. Benjamin was just grateful that he and John's friendship had survived despite the fact that Benjamin had voted for Jefferson when the two men had vied for the presidency. Though John and Benjamin had had disagreements themselves, they wrote frequently now, and Benjamin was glad that he'd maintained a friendship both with Jefferson and Adams. He considered it a great tragedy that two of the greatest founding fathers of America had been driven apart by political contention. As his eyes finally fluttered closed, Benjamin's mind drifted into sleep. As dreams enveloped him, he found himself standing across from a young man, holding a book. He recognized him immediately as Richard, one of his youngest sons, who was currently working as a lawyer in Philadelphia. "What is that book in your hands?" Benjamin asked. "It is the history of the United States," Richard replied. "Shall I read a page of it to you?" Benjamin immediately shook his head. No, I believe in the truth of no history, but in that which is contained in the Old and New Testaments." "But sir," Richard said, "this page relates to your friend, Mr. Adams." Benjamin's interest was immediately piqued. "Let me see it then." He took the book from his son's hands and started to read. It began, 1809. Among the most extraordinary events of this year was the renewal of the friendship and intercourse between Mr. John Adams and Mr. Jefferson, the two ex-presidents of the United States. Benjamin read the words with great amazement. A renewal of friendship. It continued on, explaining how the two men had early on become friends since they worked together in Congress in 1775, but that a disagreement on subjects like the French Revolution had driven them apart. Adams, it stated, after losing the presidency in 1800, retired with resignation and dignity to his seat at Quincy, where he spent the evening of his life in literary and philosophical pursuits, surrounded by an amiable family and a few old and affectionate friends. Jefferson, on the other hand, resigned the chair of the United States in the year 1808, sick of the cares and disgusted with the intrigues of public life, and retired to his seat at Monticello in Virginia, where he spent the remainder of his days in the cultivation of a large farm, agreeably to the new system of husbandry. But it was the next part that truly amazed Benjamin. In the month of November 1809, the book continued, Mr. Adams addressed a short letter to his friend Mr. Jefferson, in which he congratulated him upon his retirement, and concluded it with assurances of his regard and good wishes for his welfare. Mr. Jefferson replied to this letter, and reciprocated expressions of regard and esteem. These letters were followed by a correspondence of several years, in which they mutually reviewed the scenes of business in which they had been engaged, and candidly acknowledged to each other all of the errors of opinion and conduct into which they had fallen during the time that they filled the same station in the service of their country. Many precious truths, the result of observation, experience, and profound reflection, it is said, are contained in these letters. It is to be hoped the world will be favored with a sight of them. Then Benjamin read the final words. These gentlemen sunk into the grave nearly at the same time, full of years and rich in the gratitude and praises of their country. As Benjamin awoke, the dream stayed firmly etched on his mind. He'd always been interested in dreams from a psychiatric standpoint, and as a devout Christian, he felt sure that there was something significant in what he had seen in this night vision. It might, he thought, be the very means that these men could be finally reconciled. Even though Thomas Jefferson was urged to run for a third term, he followed the example of George Washington and graciously stepped down from power at the end of 8 years, saying, "That I should lay down my charge at a proper season is as much a duty as to have borne it faithfully." And he let the burden pass with great relief, calling his presidency a splendid misery. Jefferson had devoted virtually his entire adult life to what he called the holy cause of freedom, and he was happy to return to the people. It was shortly after his retirement to Monticello that something remarkable happened. One of the most beautiful and poignant examples of the faith of our founding fathers is found in the story of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's reconciliation. Benjamin Rush, who we absolutely need to cover in a future episode because he's amazing. He was one of their fellow signers of the Declaration of Independence, and even through the politically tumultuous years following 1800, he still managed to maintain a friendship both with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, even when neither one had spoken to each other in about a decade. In October of 1809, around 7 months after Jefferson had retired, Benjamin Rush had a profound dream. In this dream, he was shown a glimpse into the future of the United States, and the future of his two friends. He was shown that history would remember them both as important founding fathers, and that they would again become friends and write volumes of correspondence that would become a treasure trove of wisdom for future generations. And perhaps the most incredible thing that he foresaw was that the two men would die at nearly the same time. When Rush had this dream, not a single part of it had been fulfilled or could have been predicted, but he wrote the dream down and sent it to John Adams. This action set in motion the chain of events that eventually led them to their reconciliation. Adams did eventually write to Thomas Jefferson, and a correspondence again opened between them. They both expressed their great love and esteem for each other, and their letters sent back and forth are indeed a treasure trove that give us a lot of insight into who these men were and what they believed. One of the most touching examples comes from a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to John Adams after the death of his wife Abigail. Jefferson himself knew much of grief, and his words reflect that. He wrote, "I will not therefore by useless condolences open afresh the sluices of your grief, nor although mingling sincerely my tears with yours, will I say a word more where words are vain. But that it is of some comfort to us both, that the term is not very distant, at which we are to deposit, in the same cerement, our sorrows and suffering bodies, and to ascend in essence to an ecstatic meeting with the friends we have loved and lost, and whom we shall still love and never lose again. God bless you and support you under your heavy affliction." This, along with many other examples that I could point to, show us Jefferson's deep, faith-filled convictions. And this was something that he shared with his wife Martha, who was described by those who knew her as saintly. But one of our greatest statements on faith from Jefferson actually comes from a letter that he wrote to Benjamin Rush. who asked him to explain his beliefs. Jefferson responded, quote, "My views of the Christian religion are the result of a life of inquiry and reflection, and very different from the anti-Christian system imputed to me by those who know nothing of my opinions. To the corruptions of Christianity I am indeed opposed, but not to the genuine precepts of Jesus himself. I am a Christian, in the only sense in which he wished anyone to be, sincerely attached to his doctrines in preference to all others." Now, it's true that Jefferson had some different views of Christianity and different opinions about it than many people of his day and many evangelical Christians now. This is especially true of his later years that he spent in retirement at Monticello. You might say that he went through a bit of a religious revolution. In the early 1800s, a spiritual movement, which was part of the Second Great Awakening, swept through Virginia. It became known as Christian Primitivism or Restoration Christianity. They called for an end of all denominations and refused to call themselves anything other than Christians. This group was seeking to revive a purer form of Christianity. And in this pursuit to purify the church, they rejected many early creeds and the doctrines that were established through them, including the Trinity, or the Three-in-One. But by doing this, they weren't rejecting Jesus as the Son of God, or the means of salvation, but just as being part of the Trinity. The central idea was that they needed to get back to the original teachings of Jesus. They also had more of a preference and saw more credibility in the Gospels rather than the Old Testament and the Epistles. Jefferson embraced many of these ideas, which is evident in his later writings. He said, "The genuine and simple religion of Jesus will one day be restored, such as it was preached and practiced by himself. I hope that the day of restoration is to come." He also said, "Happy is the prospect of a restoration of primitive Christianity. I must leave to younger athletes to encounter and lop off the branches which have been grafted into it by the mythologists of the Middle and Modern Ages." He also made this interesting observation. Had the doctrines of Jesus been preached always as pure as they came from his lips, the whole civilized world would have now been Christian. And truth will prevail over fanaticism, and the genuine doctrines of Jesus, so long perverted by his pseudo-priests, will again be restored to their original purity. This reformation will advance with other improvements of the human mind, but too late for me to witness it. So obviously these are not very conventional Christian ideas. And it's true that Jefferson felt that denominations often divided Christians, whereas the actual teachings of Jesus united them. And he did criticize some denominations for this. In his writings, you also find him questioning certain doctrines, like the Immaculate Conception of Jesus, original sin, and other doctrines seen by many as core tenets of Christianity. So you can very well conclude that Jefferson was not an orthodox Christian by many standards. As he said himself, "I am of a sect by myself as far as I know." But even as we grant that, it doesn't make him an atheist or a deist. We've established that Jefferson believed in God, and he can't be a deist because deists do not believe that God is involved in the affairs of men. And that was certainly not Thomas Jefferson. Just because Jefferson's perception of God was different than the traditional Christians of his time, does not mean he did not believe in or worship God, and consider himself a Christian. He literally told John Adams, "An atheist I can never be." And to his friend Charles Thompson, he wrote, "I am a real Christian. That is to say, a disciple of the doctrines of Jesus." No one who really studies the life of Thomas Jefferson can deny him that. He truly tried to pattern his way of living after the life and morals of the Master. Candlelight flickered through the crowded bedroom. Tones hushed as quiet tears were shed. Thomas Jefferson Randolph watched his grandfather's aged face with great sadness and affection. His cousins and their spouses gathered around. The weight of impending separation settled upon all of them, and they knew that the time of parting was soon at hand. Thomas felt tears well in his eyes. He had spent much of his 34 years at his grandfather's side, in which time he had cultivated the deepest respect, love, and admiration that one could possess. Childhood memories raced through his mind. Working alongside his grandfather in the flower gardens, the foot races along with other games that he'd organized for them in the summer evenings, dancing around him as he played the violin, or sitting around the fire, reading with him, or listening to him speak. He talked to them freely, affectionately, and never missed an opportunity to teach them a valuable lesson. He laughed at their small follies and addressed the serious ones with kindness and serious admonition. He seemed to have the ability to read their hearts, to see their invisible wishes, and delighted to grant them. The aged Jefferson lay in bed, face pale. "I have done for my country and for all mankind all that I could do," he said wearily, "and now I resign my soul without fear to my God." Several around the room shed tears as his eyes fluttered closed in sleep. Many in the crowd of family members continuously looked to the clock. The morrow would bring the anniversary of independence, and it seemed appropriate for such a man's death to coincide with the 4th of July. At one point Jefferson opened his eyes, asking, "This is the 4th?" As the hands neared midnight, a peaceful expression fell over his countenance, which seemed to say, "Just as I had wished." The hours passed in painful anticipation. Then, at 15 minutes past noon, on July 4th, the great founding father peacefully took his last breath, slipping from this life into the next. Just a few hours after Thomas Jefferson passed away, John Adams joined him, fulfilling Benjamin Rush's prophecy that the two men would sink into the grave nearly at the same time. And incredibly, they died on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1826. And as John Adams died, his last words were reported to be, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Though he was wrong, Jefferson had actually preceded him in death, his words have been immortalized, and have come to symbolize the fact that Jefferson does survive in his contribution to human rights, education, and the overall morality of a nation. And who's to say that Jefferson in spirit could not have been in attendance at his fellow founding fathers' passing? As great a loss as these two men were to America, Nicholas Biddle, who was alive at the time, put it well when he said of Jefferson, "The grief that such a man is dead may be well assuaged by the proud consolation that such a man has lived." Now, as we come to the conclusion of this 3-part episode series on Thomas Jefferson, I think the best way to solidify everything that we've discussed is through a letter written by Jefferson's oldest grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, who sent his recollections of his grandfather to biographer Henry S. Randall. There is perhaps no more credible source. Randolph writes, "In compliance with your request, I have committed to paper my reminiscences of Mr. Jefferson, as they say, still green and fresh in my memory, have occurred to me. I was 34 years old when he died. I was more intimate with him than with any man I have ever known. His character invited such intimacy. Soft and feminine in his affections with his family, he entered into and sympathized with all their feelings, winning them to paths of virtue by the soothing gentleness of his manner. His private apartments were open to me at all times. I saw him under all circumstances. While he lived and since, I have reviewed with severe scrutiny those interviews, and I must say that I never heard from him the expression of one thought, feeling, or sentiment inconsistent with the highest moral standard, or the purest Christian charity in its most enlarged sense. His moral character was of the highest order, founded upon the purest and sternest models of antiquity, softened, chastened, and developed by the influences of the all-pervading benevolence of the doctrines of Christ, which he had intensely and admiringly studied. As proof of this, he left 2 codifications of the morals of Jesus, one for himself and another for the Indians. The first of these I now possess. And he goes on to say, the boldness and self-confidence of his mind was the best guarantee of his truthfulness. He never uttered an untruth himself. No end with him could sanctify falsehood. He detested impiety. In his contemplative moments, his mind turned to religion, which he studied thoroughly. He had seen and read much of the abuses and perversions of Christianity. He abhorred those abuses and their authors, and denounced them without reserve. He was regular in his attendance at church, taking his prayer book with him. A gentleman of some distinction, calling on him and expressing his disbelief in the truths of the Bible, his reply was, "Then, sir, you have studied it to little purpose." He was guilty of no profanity himself, and did not tolerate it in others. His precepts were those of truth and virtue. His family, by whom he was surrounded and who saw him in all the unguarded privacy of private life, believed him to be the purest of men. His precepts were those of truth and virtue. Be just, be true, love your neighbor as yourself and your country more than yourself, were among his favorite maxims. And they recognized in him a truthful exemplar of the precepts he taught. What a tender tribute from someone who knew Jefferson so well. In the sermon by Reverend William Bennett on Christian morals, the one that was sent to Jefferson by Edward Dowse, Bennett teaches this great principle. Quote, "In the scriptures, the application of religion to practice is expressed by the term holiness, and the maturity or perfections of its principles, appearing in the demeanor and actions of men, is elegantly called the beauties of holiness." Jefferson was a Christian, in the powerful sense that he applied the teachings of Christ and led a, if not perfect life, a holy one. So much so that he had no fear in approaching his Maker, considering himself clean before God. This is the beauty of holiness. If we could only understand, as Jefferson did, the importance of individual morality, the problems in our society would vanish overnight. But this process of purity begins with us. We cannot change the world until we change ourselves. And Thomas Jefferson is proof of what one moral person can accomplish, and that a single example can ignite our faith.